Remix is your bundler, it's your router, and it's your data fetching library. And you don't have to do any of the wiring to make any of that stuff work.
Hi everyone, welcome to JavaScript Jam. Today's guest is somebody who really truly needs no introduction. It's Kent C. Dodds, the Director of Developer Experience at Remix. And let me just drive home, how he definitely needs no introduction. This is the State of JavaScript in 2021 survey. And you'll see right below,
I don't see your screen. Are you sharing?
Oh, sorry. There we go. Forgot to hit that second button. There we go. So this is the State of JavaScript survey in 2021. And you can see right below Dan is there's Kent. Really one of the most popular, shall we say, influencers or educators in the JavaScript ecosystem. And now part of the team at Remix, which is also extremely popular. So here's State of JavaScript survey, just came out in November as an open source framework. Just a few months ago, and already it's number 2 here on out of nowhere, shot out of nowhere, in the most popular interested JavaScript frameworks. So a framework that needs no introduction, and a developer needs no introduction. But for those who don't know, Kent, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a software developer. Been working in the JavaScript space since I graduated from college in 2014. Even a little bit before that, I guess. Really early on, I started teaching on Egghead and speaking at conferences, domestic and foreign, all over. And so teaching has just become a big part of what I do and who I am, which I think is why I've been able to reach a lot of people. And so I've worked at various companies as a product engineer, team lead. I was at PayPal for 3 years, shipping products to millions of engineers. They still use the tooling that I set up there. I left there about 3 years ago. And then after my time at PayPal, I spent 3 years as a full-time educator. I built Epic, React.dev, and testingjavascript.com. And then I rebuilt my website using Remix, and all I wanted to do was teach people how to use Remix. And so in talking with the Remix folks about how we can collaborate and stuff, we decided it'd just be a lot easier if I was a part of the company. So I joined the company as a co-founder and the Director of Developer Experience, and that is me from a technical standpoint. I live in Utah, and I have a wife and 4 kids and a dog, and I like to be active. Yeah, snowboarding, skiing. I have a fun one wheel that I like to ride in the summertime. So that's me.
Yeah, it's a great place to be for all those activities. But I want to get back actually to the Remix story. So Remix went open source. It was closed source before that. It went open source in November. Did you join as Director of Developer Experience around the same time or before? What was the timing of that?
Yeah. I joined up about 2 weeks before we went open source. And so I joined after they announced they were going open source, but before we actually went open source.
Got it. Okay. What would you say, is the reason why Remix exists, and what would be the origin story of Remix? I know it's from Ryan and Michael who have done React Router and a bunch of other things in the ecosystem, but maybe explain to the audience who aren't familiar with Remix and its origin, where it came to be.
Yeah, sure. So Remix is really actually just an evolution of React Router. And so Michael likes to call it a compiler for React Router. I think it's maybe a little bit more than just that, but React Router is really the core of what Remix is. So as far as the origin story, Ryan and Michael have been wanting to build a React-based framework for years, like over 6 years, as long as they've been together, and just never got around to it because they're training business. Well, the pandemic just totally desecrated their training business. And so they had to pivot, and they decided, hey, how about we write software and we get people to pay for the software we write? Very novel idea. and so that was the idea. Was they actually, if I recall correctly, Ryan was actually building a platform to sell something else. I think I think it was online courses. Mm-hmm. And as he was building that, he was building out what became Remix. And so as they were working on this framework that they were using to build that platform, they're like, wow, this framework's actually really cool. Let's focus on this. And so that's kind of where Remix came from. They started demoing it to me in early pandemic times, and I was really excited by it. This is like super, super early, but I could really see that they were doing the right things with exposing the web platform to me as the developer. And so the abstractions were relatively minimal, and the things that I spent my time learning was a web platform rather than Remix specific abstractions. And so I could tell that the foundation that they were building on was really solid. And so by the time that they came out with the developer preview as a paid product in October of 2020, I was all over it. And I grabbed a license right away and started playing around with it. And then it wasn't for another couple months that I decided to rewrite my website in Remix myself. And they continued to iterate on it and make a lot of changes until finally it was open sourced in November. And the reason they decided to open source it was I feel like they could have been really successful having a paid product and license structure, but they decided they really wanted to just reach as many people as possible with this framework, because a big part of the motivation behind Remix is to make the web a better place. And so it's easier to do that when people are using it, and it's easier to get them to use it if it's free. So that was the strategy there. They raised $3 million, an initial funding round, hired a bunch of people, we have 8 employees total now, myself and Ryan and Michael included. And yeah, we're just trying to make the best framework that there can be for building web apps.
If I'm not, from a JavaScript developer, maybe I'm familiar with some of the other, say, older React full stack frameworks out there. I guess it's all relative in the ecosystem because it moves so quickly. But who would you say Remix is intended for? And what are like the core principles and opinions that differentiate Remix from, the other frameworks out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Remix, it started out as a React framework, but it's really become a web framework that happens to use React right now. In the future, we will abstract away the pieces of like the router to make a Remix router, and then a React adapter for that, and then you'll have a Preact adapter and whatever other UI library you want to bring along. Just make an adapter for whatever UI library you want, because 90% of Remix has nothing to do with React. And so it is a web framework, and the target is anybody who's building something on the web. So it's like pretty big target. But our focus, of course, like you can't have an enormous target without a focus.
Yeah.
Our focus right now is users of React Router, of which 7 out of 10 websites that use React are using React Router. And then Reach Router as well is kind of a branch off of React Router. And so there's a lot of Reach Router users as well. And so our goal is to help people incrementally migrate their React Router apps to use Remix. And we've got a lot of really cool plans to make that even easier. Yeah, that's our primary target. We're happy to have people come over from their Gatsby and their Next.js apps and their whatever other tech stack they're using. Yeah, our focus is React Router users right now.
Okay. So logical upgrade path for folks who are used to React Router, which is a large install base. Are there types of applications or use cases where you'd say that Remix isn't a fit? Maybe a control panel, or a dashboard or something like that, or some situation where server-side rendering isn't as important. How would you what would you give an example of, this is it is some of these things are not like the other kind of?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start by saying there are some use cases that can't take advantage of a lot of the features that Remix offers. But I'm unaware of other frameworks that offer you anything more for those use cases anyway. And so even in those situations, you may not be able to take advantage of a lot of cool features of Remix, but like, tell me something else that you could use that would do any better. And I'm not certain that there is. So So even in those situations, I'd still say use Remix. So I don't think that there's anything where Remix makes it harder for you to build that type of app, I guess is what I'm saying. And so, yeah, a dashboard is like, it maybe is a good example because there's not a lot of routing. All of the routing is happening in search params and stuff where you got like 30 widgets on the page. Each one has a specific search param. Remix gives you control over the search params. You can interact with those search params. There's some nuance there that makes things difficult, which is why React Location by Tanner Lindsley exists. But I think there are not a lot of use cases where Remix isn't well suited for those things anyway. If you're building something like a game that's just like a canvas thing, you can't render that on the server. You're still fine to use Remix for that. I'm not sure what you would use, what else you could use that would serve you better than Remix anyway. So yeah, it's pretty much we're well suited for anybody who wants to build something on the web.
Okay. And one thing interesting you said is 90% of Remix has nothing to do with React. Could you elaborate on that point a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So, and that's not just in the Remix code base itself, but also as users of Remix, you spend a lot less time doing React things. If you're just talking about code, then I mean, I haven't done the actual calculation, but this is just my gut feel understanding the code base, that most of the code has nothing to do with React. There's like, we have hooks, we have components, but that is such a small fraction of what React is, or what Remix is. And I think that's important, as much as like, let's be clear. React is like outrageously more widely used than every other framework. If there are not a lot of really great metrics for that, but the best one I found is DevTool installs. So in your browser DevTools, that's a pretty good proxy for a good measurement. And if you are measuring that, React is almost 3 times as popular as all of the other ones combined. So React is enormous. If you're looking at Twitter and you're like, oh my gosh, look at all these new frameworks, like React is going the way of the dinosaurs. I am sorry, but like maybe one day, but right now it will be very difficult for anything to topple React. That said, we want to be forward looking and we want to make sure that we don't just tie ourselves to a single UI framework. There are other ones that have interesting aspects to them. And different trade-offs and stuff, and because we so much of what Remix is has nothing to do with React, we are going to support other frameworks in the future.
Oh wow, that's really exciting. Like, do you have a number 2 after React yet?
Yeah. The number 2 is Preact. That'll be the easiest one. Okay. And then from there,
that makes sense.
From there, it actually once you have it. And we want to do that without the Preact compat thing. So like it's completely different framework from that perspective.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
And so once you get to that point, then everybody else can just do the same thing that you did. So like you make a framework agnostic router and everything, and then just have an adapter that hooks into that. And then we make another adapter, and then people look at the Preact and React adapters and they build their Angular one or their Svelte or whatever. And we're not there are so many things that we can do to make the framework better. And React is still just so wildly popular that it's not really a huge priority for us to support other UI libraries, but we're going to enable other people to do that if that's what they want to do.
Okay. What could you elaborate on? What are the jobs to be done that let's say approximately 90% of that code that doesn't have to do with React, what is it doing that's making the developer life easier or something?
Oh yeah. Okay. So like speaking from a philosophical level, the thing that Remix does that is its unique value proposition to me is we like to refer to it as center stack. So you've got front end, you got back end, and on both sides of what I call the network chasm between the front end and the back end, you've got frameworks that are focused on those sides. So you've got your Next.js on the front end, you've got your Laravel and your Rails on the back end.
Yep.
And each one of them tries to shoot like a grappling hook over this network chasm. It's like, all right, so we sent HTML, and we have this little framework that like can communicate across that grappling hook, or okay, we sent a fetch request, and we've got some system for serverless functions and stuff. But neither one, or on neither side, have they really done what I think Remix is able to do, and that is, with being center stack, we really have just taken ownership over the network. And so we've built this solid bridge where on the front end, we are able to communicate really nicely with the back end. On the back end, we're able to server render really and do the things that are right for the front end. And so as a developer, it doesn't really feel like that network exists. And in the situations where, of course, you do need to acknowledge that, like, yeah, sometimes your request is going to take 3 seconds long because the user's on a 2G connection. We're going to give you the tools that you need to give the user the proper user experience for that sort of situation. And so as you're looking at the code, it's a lot simpler because Remix is your bundler, it's your router, and it's your data fetching library. And you don't have to do any of the wiring to make any of that stuff work. And so that's from a philosophical standpoint, that is like one of the key benefits to using Remix. Another one is the kind of tied to this is the focus on progressive enhancement. So where a lot of backend frameworks, they're focused on sending HTML and then sprinkling in some JavaScript to make the experience a little bit nicer. They can easily fall over from an accessibility standpoint, also performance standpoint. You know, like we can get the HTML to the user really fast, but once the user's on the site, now what is their experience like? And so that's something where backend frameworks typically struggle a little bit. Front-end frameworks will struggle with that initial load because you've got to load the framework first, and you end up with this waterfall cascade. And so when you're using Remix, because Remix is focused so much on progressive enhancement, the JavaScript that you load into the browser does not enable the experience, it enhances the experience. And that's the key difference between Remix and other front-end frameworks, is that it's based on the mental model and the technology of Web 1.0. So send HTML, use forms for mutations, and all of that stuff works whether or not the JavaScript is finished loading yet. And YouTube actually is always my example that I go to for a web application that has like an outrageously huge budget and really does care about performance, but has a serious problem with from a user experience standpoint because they bet so heavily on just being a 100% client-side app. And I've got this demo where I, as a user, actually experienced this. I wasn't hunting for problems on the internet. I experienced this problem. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. But I went to youtube.com and I typed in the search bar and hit enter, and my search was cleared. And as I investigated, it didn't actually search. It just like removed my input. And as I investigated, I found out that it was because the JavaScript hadn't finished loading. So I'm not sure, like they did it really bad because they don't even server render the input. And so they render the input as soon as their first JavaScript loads, and then they go fetch some additional JavaScript. So in that interim period, you have an input that you can type into, hit enter, and they loaded enough JavaScript to prevent default and clear the input, but not enough to actually perform the search. So,
oh man.
So yeah, they really shot themselves in the foot there. But they wouldn't have this problem if they used progressive enhancement. So you server render the HTML, it has the input on there. The user types in, hits enter. Forms know what to do when the user does that. Like the browser has built in the capability to handle that. And so so long as you don't break that, like we typically do with our event prevent default and our own custom fetch stuff, then it should be good. And so that's something else that Remix is focused on from a philosophy standpoint, is the progressive enhancement piece.
So that, just for the audience, like progressive enhancement, if I was to say it the most simply, is like the site will still work with JavaScript off.
Yeah. Well, and like that's not necessarily a huge important aspect, and not every site can work without JavaScript,
Sure.
and we want to have JavaScript, right? Like for accessibility
Yes.
reasons and stuff like that. And if you're building Figma, like you're not going to work without JavaScript.
Yeah.
But from a like a baseline, being able to render something to the user that the user can start using while they're waiting for the JavaScript to load is really beneficial, rather than just showing them this big interstitial loading screen. So yeah, and that's actually one thing that I don't know if we want to get into talking about partial hydration and stuff, but when you can server render like really fast, like sub-second page to your user, and then the page that you've rendered works before the JavaScript is loaded, then why does it matter how much JavaScript you end up loading while the users actually started using your page? And so, I mean, it does matter, because we do want the JavaScript eventually to give the user a better experience. But it matters a lot less when your JavaScript doesn't enable the app; it just enhances the app. So anyway, we don't need to get too far into that.
No, but I want to highlight, like, what you're talking about is critically important. Like, there's a Core Web Vital metric, right? First input delay. If you've got a lot of JavaScript running, it could delay that. There's another one, time to interactive. And, translate this to, financial impact. If you are, a travel and hospitality site, for example, where the first thing you do when you go to, say, Kayak or Expedia is you go to that form and you enter your date, you enter like something you're going, or a search form, like what you were doing in YouTube, right? Those are situations where the first thing the user does is they go and interact, as opposed to, say, a news article where the first thing they want to do is see the content. And maybe if the JavaScript's preventing, input and interactivity, that's okay. But for a lot of transactional sites, this is what you're talking about is very important for it to be responsive. But I'd love to get to your demo.
Yeah.
So I think that might be a good seg to that. Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Let me get my screen shared. And there we go. So yeah, this is the remix.run website. If you want a good quick overview, just go to remix.run and scroll, because we have a really nice overview of like what makes Remix so special and everything. The demo that I want to show is we kind of skip the create remix thing. One thing that I notice a lot of frameworks will do is they focus a lot of their demos on like, watch how fast it is for me to get up and running and get started with this thing. That's always like the de facto demo, like how fast can I get up and running? I think that's important. But I'm much more interested in like, unless I'm spinning up a new project every single day, that's not really as important to me.
It's a really good point.
Yeah. What I'm doing every day is I'm maintaining the project that I spun up like 3 months ago. So Remix has really solidly nailed that maintenance story. So if you're on a team of developers, the mental model that you have and everything is just so good. What we're working on right now, and hopefully we'll release on Monday, is an even better getting started story where you basically run a script and it will have a Postgres database set up for you with authentication and everything, and session management and all that stuff, and not hidden behind abstractions, but like the code is there for you to evaluate and change as your requirements change. And so I'm excited about that, but that's part of the reason why I'm not showing you like, hey, let's get started with Remix. It's because I think that's like, it's important, but not nearly as important as the maintainability of software. And so what the demo that I'm going to show you is kind of talking a little bit about progressive enhancement, as well as the mental model that Remix gives you as you're building your sites. So I have this really simple notes app where I can enter my notes 1, 2, 3. You got to spell it right. No, actually, it would work even if I spelled it wrong. But then you can delete them. So it's pretty straightforward. And I'll just take you on a quick tour of what that looks like from an implementation standpoint. So our app is structured in this way, where pretty much everything that matters is in the app directory. And under the app directory, you have your entry server. That's the first part of your code that's going to run when your app starts up. And so when a request is made, this handle request function is going to be called. You're responsible for rendering or for returning a response. And so in our case, we probably want to render our HTML document. And so we render this Remix server component, which is going to take care of routing to the right modules and everything. And then we send back our HTML response. I actually really like this aspect of Remix because it means that I get to control things. I can, if I wanted to do the React streaming or whatever, I don't have to look in the Remix docs like, how do I do streaming? I'm literally looking at it right now. I just changed this to do whatever React streaming API is.
It's all exposed.
Yeah, yep, exactly. The same thing for the client side. You're responsible for hydrating. And what's really cool about this is, our root component where we're responsible for like the first component that gets rendered on every page, we get to have control over everything between the opening and closing HTML, which I think is really unique. Most of the time with frameworks, you don't get that control, at least with front-end frameworks. You typically are rendering inside of the body or on a div that has an ID of root or something. And so what's cool about this is on my website, I have state that controls a class name on the HTML element, and also you can have state to control the title. We actually have better APIs for that, but like all of the stuff that people are typically using React use effect for making mutations in the area of the DOM that they don't get to control, you don't have that problem when you're using Remix. So I really like that Remix just exposes all of that to you as a user. So unfortunately, we won't have too much time to talk about nested routing, and this demo doesn't really showcase nested routing much, but that's an enormous part of what makes Remix so special, so maybe we can talk about it later. But for this demo, I have this notes route, and I showed you what it looks like. The way that it works is you export default React component. You use the use loader data hook from Remix, and that'll get you your data, and I'll show you where you write out that here in a sec. And then in here, if there are no notes, then we'll just say no notes yet. Otherwise, we'll iterate over those notes. And then we also render our form for our logout button. This might be kind of strange for some people to see, like, why didn't you just add an on-click on the button? This is, we're using forms here. This is progressive enhancement right here. And so, yeah, every mutation should be wrapped in a form. Now, like, there are some situations where that doesn't really make sense. For example, on my blog, as you read through the article, if you spend 60% of the time that it would take to actually read the whole thing, and you scroll down to the bottom of the page, I will mark it as read for you. That's a mutation. I don't have any user interaction there. So Remix absolutely has mechanisms for JavaScript only requests like that. Yeah. Otherwise, that would be really weird. But for the sorts of things where users are interacting, yeah, put it in a form. That's the way that the web has always worked. So we've got a form for the logout. We have a form for creating an item. I'll show you more about that in a second. And then a form for deleting a post. So
yeah, I just want to highlight for the audience, like how different this is, right? You've got an action, you've got a method. This is like if you had been coding PHP, you know, back in the day, or Rails, like this is what you're used to. There's no prevent default. It's just doing what the browser naturally would have done. So that's in some sense a breath of fresh air, but very different from what I think a lot of React developers are used to.
No, you're totally right. And what's really cool about this is that it's not a weird forms abstraction. We'll see here in a second how Remix exposes the underlying APIs, the web APIs to you to do additional things. But I was actually kind of disappointed when Mark wasn't able to make it. I mean, congratulations in his personal life and everything, but because his bio says that he's been doing this since before JavaScript was invented. I'm like, oh man, he's going to really like this. But yeah, anyway, he'll just have to try it later. So let's talk about getting the data here. So we have this use loader data. Where the heck is that coming from? So our loader is in this exact same file. And what's different between that component and the loader is that the component runs on the client and the server for server rendering, client for rehydration. And then the loader only runs on the server. And so and then Remix is the one to make sure that the data that you return from the loader gets into our component. So Remix is managing that, and not just on the initial render, which is what a lot of frameworks do that. Like they'll just say, hey, we've got this way for you to run some code on the server, go get that initial data. And then you're like completely on your own to update that as things change. So Remix will call this as there are mutations made as well. And so you don't ever have to think about keeping your state up to date, which means like goodbye Redux, you don't need it. All of these different state management libraries that are intended for managing state between the like across that network chasm. Remix has built a solid bridge. You don't need to worry about it.
So that's also another huge sea change. So that means effectively the state is living in both places and automatically synced, or should we think about mentally that the state is on the server and that's where the system of record, so to speak,
Yes, that's
is?
the way you should think about it. It dawned on me the other day that when I'm using Remix, my Redux store is the database, and that is pretty profound. Whereas the status quo for client-side apps is you have your own store that we call state, but it's not state. This is a cache of state, and
It's really
yeah,
a cache. Yeah,
yeah. And
absolutely.
so with Remix, we just embrace that fact and we handle it for you. And we keep that cache up to date for you. And it's actually really simple the way that we do it. And so there's not a lot of implementation complexity. We're leveraging a lot of cool things about the platform for prefetching and maintaining that cache. And on top of that, you can further cache it with HTTP caching by taking this and saying, hey, here are my headers, and here's my content type and whatever else I want to put in there. In our case, since we're talking about caching, your cache headers and stuff like that too. So you have a lot of control. This is just another situation where Remix is exposing the API, the platform for you. And actually, this request object that you get, this is a web fetch request. So if you want to learn, okay, what are the things I can do with this request object? You go to MDN. You don't go to the Remix docs. You go to MDN. And then you say, what do I return from a loader? Well, what you actually return is a response. And so we just have this little helper because returning JSON is pretty normal. But all you need is a response, and you can do whatever you want to in there, set your headers and whatever else. And this is all web fetch stuff. So no special weird request response API that you need to learn. And then Remix normalizes this across platforms as well. And so like whatever platform you're deploying to, they all have their own request response APIs. Remix just normalizes it all, so it's all just web fetch.
Oh, wow. Great.
It sure is, yeah. So, and the fact that this runs on the server also means that I can talk directly to my database right here. So I don't have to, if I have like a third-party API, I've got private keys to, I can deploy my private keys. I don't have to worry about sharing those with people or whatever. No CORS errors at all. That's not a problem here. And all that Remix does is it says, okay, you run this on the server. I'll be responsible for going to make that call. You run whatever code you want and send back whatever you need. And so it drastically simplifies things. You don't need to make a separate API routes folder and have those deployed as serverless functions that your client-side app is talking to, and you're responsible for making all those fetch calls and stuff. It's in the same file, and Remix makes sure that this data stays up to date as the user's using the app.
And when the client-side code needs this, it basically fetches that back to the same server-side loader.
Yeah. So initially,
it.
when it's rendered, this the loader is going to be called on the server. It's all server rendering. It'll pass that data onto the React component for the server render, and then that gets serialized into the HTML. So when it rehydrates, it has the same data. And then as the user is navigating around, now it's a spa, and so like now we're clicking different links and stuff. And so Remix is doing fetch requests to all these different loaders to get that data. So as far as you're concerned, it's no different whether it's a server render or a client transition, which drastically simplifies things too.
Got it. And one thing you mentioned there is the data is serialized into the HTML for the hydration step, so it doesn't have to fetch it again, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, great. Another intelligent thing you guys have already built in for improving performance.
Yep. And that's the thing. Like, people will show us, hey, look at my new thing that's technically really amazing, and we're like, that's awesome. Let's see what we can learn from it. And we re-implement what they've done in Remix and find out that Remix is as good or better. That's what we did with the next demo. We did this with the React Server Components demo that they have. And so that's our, like, you can talk about things that are technically better all day, but like, show me how it's better. Like, build something for me and show me that it's better. And that's our focus is we want to make things that are actually better, measured with a device that's in India on a 3G network or something. So that's the types of measurements that we make. Okay, so let's keep going with this demo. Sorry, I know that we're taking a while on the demo, but I want to show a couple of things here. So let's talk about the submissions of actions and stuff. So this is going to actually hit a different route. This will hit our log out, where it has our action function for logging out. We could probably put it in the same one, but maybe you want this button on various other pages and stuff. So you can have it in a separate folder or a separate route. But this form does not have an action. And by the way the web works, it will post to this route. The same for this form. And so when you have two forms on the same page, you need a way to disambiguate them. And the web has a way to do that. And that is with the button, your submit button can actually have a name and a value. And that will be saved into the form. This is not a Remix thing. And actually, Remix, we just fixed a bug where you no longer need that underscore action thing anymore. You can just use regular action now. Yeah, so you say, hey, this is my action that I'm doing. I'm going to create a note, or I'm going to delete a note. And then in the same file again, this runs only on the server. So you can do all your validation logic in here and not worry about the client getting around the validation and stuff. We can get what action type we want. We can switch it. If some people look at this and like, oh my gosh, I don't want all my logic in here. Like, this is JavaScript, friends. You can put that in another file and call it if you really want to. I actually really like it right here. Personally, yeah, at least at this scale. Yeah, so then we can say, hey, if it's a delete note action type, then let's go and delete the note. Otherwise, we'll create a note. So that's how it works right now. I've got another like 5 or 10 minutes of actual, like, let's make some changes to this if we've still got time to do that.
Yeah, let's at least do a 5 minute of making changes to it so people can see what it's like.
Yeah, so let's take a look at really quick what happens if there's no JavaScript. This is not something that typically happens. Sometimes it'll happen, but this isn't what we're focusing on. I just want to talk about progressive enhancement a little bit. So I'm going to go to slow 3G. We have no JavaScript on the page, and I'm going to create a new note. So when I hit save, without JavaScript, we're going to do a full page refresh, and you'll see the favicon is spinning up there. So we're giving some feedback to the user that something is happening. The same thing happens when we hit delete. And you'll notice that it all works. And so like, that's cool. That's what progressive enhancement is. So we have a baseline of a functional app, and then we enhance the experience by adding JavaScript. So if we do go back and add JavaScript, and let's just no throttle so I can refresh really quick and then slow it down. This is where now we've added the JavaScript. So it's supposed to make the experience better, right? So like your focus state should be better and various other things, performance in general should be better. So here's our new note now. And I want you to watch carefully what happens here. So I hit save and there's no indication to the user that anything is going on. So this means that we progressively enhanced a worse experience by adding JavaScript. Now, of course, the fact is, like, the app still works. I can still create notes. I can delete them. It's just suboptimal. So that's something that you'll experience a lot when you're using Remix, is that the default experience is really great. The edge cases are not as awesome of a user experience, but there are not bugs. And that's an important key difference, is the fact that there aren't bugs here. Now, nobody who's building a app is going to just totally forget about loading states. At least if you do, it's on you. So we are going to program in some loading states in here. And I want to show you how simple that is. Typically, when you're building a form, you don't have just like this form component that posts to a backend. Like what's really cool about this, and this is part of the bridge that I was talking about, is Remix has server intelligent React components and hooks. And so like they are able to communicate intelligently between the front end and the back end. And so that's why we're able to make this experience that works without even worrying about managing state or anything like that. It's all managed for us. And so like typically when you're making a form, you have to, control this form values, and you have to have an on submit and a fetch and all of this. And then now you have to think about, what about resubmissions and race conditions, all this stuff. Remix manages all of that for you. And so we're going to use a transition from use transition from Remix. So this is a Remix hook that gives you access to the transition. Let's spell that right. And when there is a mutation on the web, that is a transition from one page to another. So that's why this is transition. So we're going to say is saving transition, and this is going to give us what type of transition is happening, what the current state of the transition is in, what location we're going to, and then the submission. And so if the transition is because we're submitting data, then that is what's going to be on this submission. So we get various information about that particular submission, including the form data, so what the user submitted. And so we have access to all of the things that the user submitted. In our case, when we create a new note, it's going to have an action underscore action property on that form data. Now, I was talking about how Remix exposes the web platform to you. This form data is a web platform API. You go look it up on MDN. And so we're leveraging the web platform to get the things that the user submitted. This means that stuff like optimistic UI is really straightforward because we can get exactly what the user submitted, and we can render something optimistic based on what they just submitted. So in our case, if the action is create note, then we know that we are currently in a saving state. And so I'm going to say, if we're saving, then we'll say saving or just save. And we'll also disable the button just for the fun of it. So I'll come over here, we'll do a slow 3G, and now I'm saving this. And we get some user feedback. It's a progressively enhanced experience. The feedback that the user gets is more contextual. It's not just a favicon. Our like accessibility can be a lot improved because we have JavaScript on the page, whatnot. We can do the same thing for the delete button, but I'm not sure how much more time we've got. I really do want to show one other thing if we do have a little bit more time for the.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely. Okay. We can go. This is the joy of being a podcast.
Yeah.
You can go a little long if need be. There's no program scheduled
okay,
right after
yeah,
us.
that's right. So stay tuned, please. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing for the delete button. We'll say is deleting. And we're going to actually, instead of getting the action, we'll just cheat and say the note ID. So if there's any submission that has a note ID, we know it's a deletion. And if that note ID happens to be the same as the one that we're currently rendering, we know we're deleting the one that is being rendered here. So we can just do the same thing, deleting, and then we have disabled is disabled. That is not what I wanted to type. I don't know even what that would have been. Okay. Cool. So let's refresh. We'll slow it down. And now we get the deleting ... But there's one problem with this that I want to demonstrate just to show you that the model of Web 1.0 doesn't quite map to the applications that we're building today. So you'll notice if we click and hold on the back button, we've got a bunch of entries in our history. And that's because the model of Web 1.0 is as you make mutations, those are actually sending you to different places. So if you create like a project, then it's going to send you to the project details page. That's like, that's pretty normal. Like a lot of applications still do that. That's a pretty normal way to do that. And Remix allows you to progressively enhance that so you don't have to totally do a refresh and everything. But lots of other use cases like this one, we're not like, it doesn't make sense to redirect the user to the same page that they're on. Like they just checked a check on a checkbox or something. And so we don't actually want to do a navigation. In addition to that, you can only have one navigation on the page at a time. And so if I say 1, 2, 3 here, and then I want to delete all 3 of these, I can actually visually only delete one of these at a time. So I'll say delete, delete. Oh, shoot. I need to throttle it down. 4 and 5. We need to throttle it so we can see what this experience looks like. So I'll say delete, delete, delete. And it only visually shows me that one of them is being deleted at a time because I'm actually navigating, and you can't navigate to 2 places at once. But really quick, just as a quick tangent, you'll notice that Remix automatically canceled these other requests. So that's what the browser does. Web 1.0, if you don't have JavaScript, if you click a link and then another link, you'll see that first link that you clicked on, that had a request, and that request was canceled. Or if you submit multiple forms. It's not going to cancel what the server's going to do about it. It'll just ignore the response that the server sends. And so Remix is, what's cool about that is the right thing happened. So Remix is always making sure that when all of the requests are done, you have the most up-to-date information. So you notice I don't have any code that says, go update my cache of the notes or whatever else. That's all just happening because Remix is making that happen. And you don't have to worry about race conditions or form resubmissions or anything like that. The Remix is managing that.
You basically maintain the order of operations. It's kind of like, as an analogy, what TCP does or HTTP does for TCP, which is make sure that, the packets come back in order in the right order. You're making sure only the last response, which is going to be the most recent data, is the one that gets
I remember talking with Ryan at length about this, actually, when he was working on the transition manager, and we were trying to figure out what is the right thing to do when you have a race condition, second request came back sooner, and all of the so many different cases. You should look at the test cases he wrote after our conversation. But basically, like the simplest way to explain it is the last response that was sent by the server is the correct one. And so we always just make sure that the last response sent by the server is the one that ends up taking. So I want to show you. Yeah.
One thing on the semantics there, sorry, is the in-flight requests you said aren't actually canceled. They're just the responses are thrown away, or are they?
Yeah. So it's impossible to cancel a request because the request is gone. And unless you build some sort of something weird between the browser and the server to say, hey, server, that thing you did? Undo that. Like you have to, that's application code at that point. And so, we cancel the request, which what really is happening is it's just canceling the response. It just ignores the response. Yep.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So the last thing that I want to show you is with this problem that we have, you might think, oh man, that's like a pretty stupid problem, Kent. That seems like we really should not have that problem. Like, I don't want entries in my back button. I don't want to only be able to do one action at a time. My user can hit delete buttons really fast.
Yeah.
So we can solve this problem really easily and model it in the same way that we model regular form submissions. And so with Remix, if you don't want to have this thing that you're doing as a global transition, like the only thing that the user can do at once, then you're going to use something else. Instead of use transition, you're going to use fetcher. It's another hook from Remix, and it has basically the same API as the transition, but I'm going to call it a fetcher instead of transition. And then instead of using the global form, which is going to do that navigation, I'm going to use a form that comes off of the fetcher. So now I'm using a specific form just specific to this particular fetcher. And on top of that, what we were doing before was we were doing a redirect. And there's some fun history. If you've ever seen the big banner that says, don't hit the back button, or like when you do hit the back button, it has this confirmation dialog. That's because they weren't doing things right. They should redirect. If you redirect, you don't have that problem. But in our case, we're not doing a navigation, so redirecting doesn't make sense. So we're going to say, let's on both of these. Well, we'll just do it on the delete note. Say return JSON success is true or whatever. We just don't want to do a redirect in this case anymore. And so that's all I needed to change. There's no mental model change. It's all is exactly the same. And also it works without JavaScript still. But if I throttle this down to a slow 3G, I can delete and delete and delete and delete. And they all show their pending state properly. And Remix makes sure that the last response that was sent from the server is the one that takes. And so you don't have to worry about keeping these up to date. So this is really awesome that you can have a single mental model for regardless of what type of update you're performing. You don't have to manage the client-side cache of your server state. And wherever you go in the application, even if your coworker Jane over there was working on this 3 months ago, you can jump right in as a team member and continue the work that she was working on. I think that's one of the really cool aspects of Remix. And that's why I quit my gainful employment as a full-time teacher to join Remix to teach everybody about this.
Wow. One of the things that's really striking home to me is, you made that comment, 90% of what Remix does isn't about React. I think the corollary to that is 90% of the assumptions in the mental model isn't React specific. And so when you are looking at code or thinking through this, you can just use, let's call it Web 1.0, as you referred to it, primitives. And what Remix has done, which I really didn't quite appreciate until we were going through this, is it's pulled those 1.0 primitives into the modern era.
Yeah, maybe remixed them
and said, yeah, maybe remix them. Thank you. I'm always one to kill a pun. It's remixed them for the web we have today and the capabilities we have today, and really modernized them. But it means that mental model still has all that same simplicity and is translatable across a wide variety of contexts. I'm really impressed how you've really kind of thought through all of that. That's the first thing that drove home to me. And it's a consequence of what you said earlier. It's 90% of this isn't actually about React. It's really about what you called the center stack. At layer 0, we've actually called it the neck, where the front end is the head and the back end is the body. And we sometimes refer to, that area as the neck. And so there's a lot of innovation in here in that center stack and that neck. And that's really fascinating. The other thing that jumped out to me is, thinking ahead, there's React server components, and there's some amount of that same, like, you can do stuff on the server and we will do the serialization and shuttling of that change management up to the client. How do you, view React server components and Remix?
Yeah, so we actually have done a fair bit of research of this. We got React server components and streaming working in Remix. We tried it out, played with it. We were disappointed with where it's at so far, but like we're still we are part of the working group, and so we're providing this as actionable feedback for them. We wrote a blog post titled React Server Components and Remix because this was a really common question we get from people, like, what about server components? And where we demonstrate that what we have today is better than what server components can offer today. And so we're not jumping on board on this experimental API that everybody seems to be okay trying to ship to production. It's been 5 years already, and they still haven't released anything. I'm not sure I want to bet my production app on unreleased software. But if they do eventually release this, and it can improve the user experience in a noticeable way, then it's actually really simple for us to support that. You literally just go to your file, you say .server, and boom, now it's a server component. So like we are well positioned to take advantage of what server components has to offer, just when it has to offer something. But right now it doesn't for us.
And your mental model actually is compatible.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that server components talks about a lot is like, we're trying to get more of your JavaScript onto the server. Well, we already do that. If you take a look at our loader, for example, like so much of what people are doing, not just the loader, but also the action, involves that network tab. And Remix, our data fetching stuff is actually there's not a lot there. It's pretty straightforward. Most of the weight of JavaScript for that is like application specific code. And so you just move all of that to your loader in your action, and you got rid of your GraphQL client, which is huge. You get rid of like Axios or whatever else you're trying to use. In here, you can of course just use fetch even on the server. And so we appreciate the goals of server components, and we're taking advantage of a lot of those. And that's actually why when server components was announced, I was really perplexed at why I wasn't so excited about it. And then I realized, oh yeah, I don't have these problems anymore because I'm using Remix. So I mean, there are some interesting ideas there, but I'm not going to be all gung-ho about shipping experimental software until it actually can improve things for my users.
Makes a lot of sense. One thing I want to highlight, just to wrap up this demo, is, the waterfalls you were showing were just, really clean. Like there were stair steps, and we've had Alex Russell, who, used to be on the Chrome team, now on the Edge team, and talk about performance and issues he's had with a lot of JavaScript frameworks being very client-side heavy, being very negative for performance. And he's actually come down really heavy on React in general. But, recently he tweeted, and actually I'll pull this up right here. Actually, if you stop your share, I'll pull this up. And he had a tweet where he, just said, I'm aligned and very much into what Remix is up to. The truth is in the trace, in the waterfall, and he had a web page test. So even a performance curmudgeon like Alex Russell is really aligned to what you guys are doing, which is high praise Indeed. So
Thank you.
hats off there. Um, so let's move on to just some other questions moving forward. Remix wasn't a closed source project; it was paid software. Now it's a open source project. What is the future plan for monetization for Remix going forward?
Yeah,
Now
so
that it's
right
open
now
source.
our biggest focus is adoption, getting a lot of people using Remix, upgrading the React Router apps
Mm-hmm.
to use Remix and just improve the web in that way. And everybody who is building a web application, it runs into um, uh, like typical problems. Like you've got to host images and you've got to do internationalization and you've got
Yeah.
like there's so many common problems for all of us. And for some of those things, you can manage that yourself. Like you can do your own authentication, you can do your own image hosting and all of that.
Yep.
But for a lot of people, those are just distractions to their business. And so our goal is to make it so that people can be as successful as possible at managing their business and building their own value proposition as they can. And so whatever those common problems that they're facing, we will build software solutions to help them manage that themselves. But if they don't want to manage it themselves, then we will provide hosted versions of those things. And so we don't have like anything specific right now that we're selling to people, but that is kind of the strategy going
Mm-hmm.
forward is companion services.
Got it. And companion services mean
Right.
companion
Yep.
cloud services,
Yep.
right? A platform. Okay. Would it be a full-on cloud platform, or would it be components,
It's
or
still
it's
TBD.
still
Yep.
TBD? Okay. And then, what are the biggest projects or companies, that are built with Remix or using
Yeah,
it in production?
so because it was just released in November, and actually, like the
Yeah.
beta was released, I think October of 2020, and so like it has been a while that we've been working on this, but a lot of companies were not super eager to jump on board with something they had to buy a license for, and
Yeah.
it technically was still developer preview, so we're like it's not production ready, so it's only been production ready since November. There are a number of companies that you definitely know. You would even recognize their logo without their name. So just imagine what you will. I'm not sure I'm at liberty to say what those
Okay.
companies are, but yeah, we're getting a lot of excitement. And something that I've noticed is there are a number of frameworks that I won't specifically name, but you've had some of them on your show who have been worked on since for about as long as Remix
Yeah.
has, and the npm download stats demonstrate that Remix has some really strong demand. I know that npm download stats are not really reliable, but actually for
Mhm.
a new framework, they certainly are, because that
Yes.
shows interest in people actually trying it and using it. And so you take a look at the Remix download stats versus other frameworks that were started around the same time, and Remix is very popular. People are very excited about Remix, and then also just judging from the community, we have Remix Conf coming up in May. I had 130 call for, or proposals submitted to give talks that I have to read through now, which is talking with other organizers. That's a lot. We've almost sold out our sponsorship slots, which also never happens. And then we have 10 meetups all over the world that have started for Remix. So there's since November, like this is month 5, I think, since then. So yeah, a lot of excitement around Remix, and I think we're only getting started. So I'm really excited about this.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also the
Mm,
State of JS survey, like that we opened with, and it's the number one, number two, highest interest framework. Where it's the only one that wasn't there last year, and already it's shot up
yeah.
to the top. What challenges or issues should folks expect if they're putting Remix in production or deploying it? Where are typically people deploying Remix apps, and
Yeah,
what's the best
so
solution these
the
days?
deployment story of Remix is actually one of its core strengths because you can deploy Remix to
Hmm.
anywhere that you can put a Docker container. You can deploy it to Cloudflare workers, so like even non-node environments. We have experimental support right now for deploying to on Dino, and or running in Dino. and we're soon to get that out of experimental support, hopefully. And so yeah, you can deploy Remix anywhere you can deploy Node and even some non-Node environments. The biggest challenges that people are going to have, though, are a lot of our target audience of React Router users are not deploying a server, at least not for their front-end app, which this would take over. So what are like for some of these companies are like, yeah, we're not deploying Node, period. Like that's just not going to happen. And we're not going to use a cloud host for stuff, period, for other reasons as well. So that's one of the biggest challenges. And so what we're doing is we're going to pull as much of what Remix is into React Router as possible, or the Remix Router framework agnostic thing. And so people can benefit from React. Like Remix, like a lot of what Remix is in the router, like I said. And so yeah, we're going to put even more of it into the router, and then more people can benefit from that, and that will help ease the migration. Eventually, we'll support Service Worker. So like we already run in a web worker. Service Worker is just like, that's what it is. And so we'll support a Service Worker eventually, so you don't have to deploy your server. And then you can incrementally make your app better and faster as you first upgrade to React Router version 6, start taking advantage of all these cool features, and then upgrade to the Service Worker so that you can start taking advantage of those features, like the actual preloading and different things like that. And then once you have that, then it just becomes a matter of, okay, now we really want to improve our performance. We're okay to deploy some sort of server or use a service. And so we're going to take all of this code in our app directory and switch where we're deploying it to. And you shouldn't have to change a lot of code to make that work.
It's kind of like progressive enhancement.
Yeah, it is a little bit. I like to say that Remix is the jQuery of platforms. So we normalize the different platforms. And so you should be able to switch where you're deploying it to, what environment you're running in. And the only thing that you have to do is make sure that the code that you're writing can run on those platforms. And in lots of cases, you can isolate the code that doesn't run on those platforms into a single file, like this is for your ORM or whatever else that you're working with. And then you just, as you decide, I want to switch platforms, you just change the code that's in there, and then you can copy paste your app into, or update your config in your app or whatever, and deploy it somewhere else.
Interesting. I'd be remiss for not mentioning we now support Remix on layer 0 out of the box. And we've got some clients looking at it very actively. So we're really excited. In fact, I was talking to one of them the other day, and they were very excited that we were going to have you on. How would you compare Remix against other full stack frameworks like Next.js or Redwood and the like, the other ones that were, the other things listed in that State of JS survey? And I know Ryan did a really good extensive blog post on this, but how would you summarize the comparison?
So I really want to just direct people to the blog post because this is certainly a nuanced conversation. Yeah. But a lot of other front-end frameworks in particular, I don't know if I'd call Next.js a full stack framework, and everybody seems to define that differently. But like a lot of people wouldn't call Remix a full stack at all either. But a lot of these other frameworks talk about that time to first byte and how important that is. And so to get that really high, you're going to do static site generation so that you can put that file on a CDN. You don't even need to run a server to generate the HTML output. Well, that was misguided because the time to first byte is only one input into the user experience. There's a lot, and even one input into performance. There's a lot more that goes into it. And in the blog post that people should go take a look at, the first TLDR is that Remix is as fast or faster than Next.js at serving static content. And then Remix is definitely faster than Next at serving dynamic content. And on top of that, when your framework is focused so much on static site generation, like Next is, they support server-side rendering, but they're all focused so much on static site generation for the performance gains that they perceive they could have. you have to make some very serious architectural decisions that are different when you're doing SSR versus SSG. And so if you decide, hey, we want to do SSG because we want it to be fast, like, of course, like that you want it to be fast. And if that's what you're told, then we're going to do SSG. And then you later decide, oh, you know what? We do have some dynamic content on this page. Well, now you're stuck with the decision. Do I give the user a loading spinner, or do I completely re-architect my solution so I can do SSR? And what we said with Remix is, hey, listen, the web has always been able to cache stuff at the CDN, and it doesn't need a file to do that. It just needs some headers. And so what we say is, if it really is static, then sure, go ahead and use HTTP cache headers and a CDN that understands those shared cache headers, and you can cache things as long as you like, and then you can purge the cache if you want to have the server rebuild it, in quotes. And so you can go ahead and get all the benefits of SSG if that's what you're going for. And then when you later find out that you need something dynamic, then all of a sudden you just turn off the cache headers and now it's dynamic. And you don't have to do any weird architecture changes or anything like that. We are super against the SSG mindset. We're pretty against the, I guess I'll say super against the Jamstack mindset, which kind of made that really popular, because we feel like the web has been able to do that and more since its inception. Or at least since the inception of CDNs and shared cache headers, which I think came before SSG was really much of a thing anyway. And so we are betting heavily on the web, and I feel like that's been a good bet.
I could keep this debate going for a whole nother hour. I'm very philosophically aligned actually to a lot of what you're saying, which is that, SSG, like after the first visit, if it's in the cache, you're basically just the same as static. And if most of your traffic is following a power law, that means it's a very small percentage of your traffic that isn't getting that very first cache hit, and you've got great performance. And we have had customers who've pointed out what you've pointed out, which is, I'd rather take the classic server-side rendered approach because my back end is not built, to handle dumping all the product data, 100 times a day, just every time a single change happens. We got to redump it and rebuild, and it can be a lot of extra work. Actually, it could be extra cost you're incurring. So I do think there is some value in some of the things they've been doing in the Jamstack in terms of taking primitives like cache control headers and essentially up-leveling them up in a way that was very easier for JavaScript developers to consume. I like to say it's kind of like that T.S. Eliot quote where, you come back to where you were and really know it for the first time. At the end of the day, we're probably going to come back to the same architecture with the cache sitting in front of server-side rendering. It just we'll have a better appreciation for it and it may be a new way of manipulating those primitives. But I totally hear a lot of what you're saying, and I think it's a really interesting breath of fresh air in the ecosystem. So I'm really excited to how Remix is shifting that
I think it's interesting that we all want the performance of Amazon.com, but we don't want to do it the way Amazon.com does it. Like, Amazon does not use HTTP caching.
Yeah.
They don't use static site generation.
Yeah.
And so I don't know why you feel like you can make a site that's got the performance metrics of Amazon without by using those approaches. So I'm looking forward to when Amazon adopts Remix. That certainly would be an endorsement if that ever happened.
There was a tweet, I'm actually searching for it right now, where it was somebody who was either a dev or a product manager at Amazon or ex-Amazon, and he's like, we couldn't even use server-side rendering. It would take too much
I saw
load.
that too. I feel like there's a lot of nuance missing there, because in all of my experimentation with React, I've never been able to get it on any reasonable hardware to take longer than a handful of milliseconds to render a full HTML document. So I feel like there's more to that story. Especially since they are definitely going to be server rendering, like you've got to server render something. It was about like using React as the template engine basically.
Exactly.
And so there are probably other template engines that you could use that could be a little faster, but I really would like to see some more nuance around that particular statement, because React, I mean, maybe it's not the fastest in the world, but I mean, I get it less than 8 milliseconds every time I try with like a legit full document. So um, at some point, and this is something that I think a lot of people get wrong, is you look at
Yeah.
something like, hey, wow, this is taking 20 milliseconds for this thing to happen, and so you get it down to 10, and now it's twice as fast. But
Yeah.
your infrastructure, the way that you have things set up, is taking 500 milliseconds to do this other thing, and so
Yep.
you're just like slicing
Yep.
off the edge of the carrot when you've got a whole carrot right here. That was maybe a bad metaphor, but like, no, there's a lot of other
Yeah.
things that you can do to improve things, and most of it has to do with your backend infrastructure. You speed that stuff up, and that's why Remix focused and does focus a lot on edge compute as well, by getting the servers closer and running in a faster runtimes. That's why Dino is important to us, and V8 isolates with Cloudflare. Like, we can get responses to I've seen actual responses from Cloudflare, full server rendered React app that like read my geolocation data. I got the whole thing in 20 milliseconds.
Mm-hmm.
It was 19 actually, 19 milliseconds. I mean, I'm on high speed internet and everything, but like 19 milliseconds, my friends, like that's fast. I don't care what you're doing on server render. You're not going to see a difference from 19 milliseconds to 8 milliseconds. Like, I don't care. So I feel like,
Blink of an eye is an order of magnitude more than
yeah,
about 300, 400 milliseconds. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. So what are you excited, just to wrap up? What are you excited about for the future of Remix that's coming down the pipe that folks should be looking at? Are you guys going to target native apps, like, or other things? Where
so we're not specifically targeting native apps, though you can use Remix to build a, like, basically do what you do with Express.js right now. So if you wanted to build a REST API, you can use Remix for that. You want to like host a GraphQL endpoint, you can use Remix for that, stuff like that. So, but as far as the UI for React Native or something like that, we have no plans. I don't expect we ever will, but like, maybe, I don't know. We could get pretty big. Who knows? Okay. But the things that I'm really excited about are, pretty soon we're going to be launching this new feature called Remix Stacks that will just get people up and going really, really fast. With authentication and testing and everything all set up for people. So I'm excited about that because people just love being able to get up and going with the framework really fast, and I think that's cool. We're also really excited to get official Dino support out of experimental. Dino is really an awesome runtime, and I think that there's a really bright future there. So excited about that. We also want to do better for real-time use cases. And so we've got it's not really an RFC, but it's just like Ryan wrote down some thoughts on an API that he's thinking about in our GitHub discussions. I'm really positive about it. I think it's a really awesome API, just like everything else that Remix has done so far. It's just been really, really solid. And so, yeah, I'm excited about the real-time aspects of Remix. I'm also really excited about working on that migration path for people who are using React Router right now and want to upgrade to Remix. So there's going to be a lot of that coming as well. And then finally, one of the big reasons that I joined up with Remix is because I had Epic React Dev, testing JavaScript.com. I was going to update both of them to TypeScript. Before doing that, I needed to make a TypeScript course so that people could learn TypeScript first. But when I ran into Remix, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do any of that. I just want to teach people Remix. And so that was my initial interest in joining Remix. And so I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the next couple months and years making the best learning experience for a framework that you've ever seen. And it will all be completely free because it's coming from the framework. So I'm really excited to work on what basically is an Epic Remix style course platform sort of thing that people can go through to get really good at building websites with Remix.
For somebody who's made such a name in technical and JavaScript education, that will be just awesome to watch and consume. Where should people go to follow you?
Yeah, the best place is go to remix.run and scroll down to the bottom. We've got links to our socials. and Discord is on there. Our Discord community is awesome. So really a big fan of our Discord community. Go join us there. We've got a YouTube channel that has some really good content on there, and we're planning on putting more on. We have Twitter that we tweet from pretty regularly. I'm at Kent C. Dodds, so feel free to follow me. And then our GitHub discussions are pretty active as well. And then for just learning, Remix has a really great onboarding or getting started documentation as well. So, and it's only getting better. That's my job. So if you don't like it, then it's my fault, and I'll try to make it better, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Kent, for being on JavaScript Jam. It's really exciting what you guys are doing with Remix. And
thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me some of your time today, and your listeners as well.
Thank you.